A little instructional video about how I want you to put together your learning objectives. I recognize that the way that we're going to do it in this class is probably not exactly how you learned it in other classes, or not how you've done it if you've been making lesson plans for uh, years or months. But for this class, it's important that we keep it this way to make it easier to keep things in alignment and make sure that the levels of Bloom's taxonomy are functioning well. So, things to remember. One, I want the goals in an outline format, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. Two, the goal of the lesson should be at least at the comprehension level of Bloom's taxonomy. So you shouldn't have recall as the overall goal, right? You always want some kind of comprehension, connection to other ideas at a minimum. Oftentimes, especially in science and math and art, you'll want it to be at the application level. Sometimes, if you're working with students who have been doing something for a long time, you can get at analysis, evaluation, or synthesis, but that's a lot to do in one lesson if you haven't had a bunch of other lessons leading up to that. Assuming that you're teaching your kids new stuff for the first time, we're going to keep our lesson goals probably at the application level-ish. But if you need to go above and beyond that, that's fine. Just make sure that everything is there to support it. All right, so what does this look like? My first example comes from some social studies material. This little unit's online. You can look at it if you want. You don't have to get into detail. It's a 3-lesson unit about Spanish colonialism or Spanish expansion, about how they became the preeminent world power for a while. Lesson 1 is about the voyage of Columbus. We're going to focus more on lesson 2, and this is all about where Spanish conquistadors came in and took over the Aztec and Incan nations. You have a main overall idea here that you may or may not want to focus on, depending on what your overall unit goal focus is. And you have some places, some people, and some terminology here. Goes over basically how Cortez came in, conquered the Aztecs, and how Pizarro years later conquered the Incans. Talks about some other Spanish explorers or conquests within what is now Central America and North America. From this, I'm going to focus on that lesson, and I'm going to say that what I want my students to take away at the end of the day from me spending 50 minutes talking about this stuff, helping them come through it, is that I want them, students will be able to, that's what the SWBT stands for, if you haven't seen it before, explain how and why the Spanish were able to conquer the native people of Central and South America. And this is a comprehension goal. So basically, I want them to understand, not just be able to recite what happened, but really understand why it happened the way that it did. Now, there's a lot of reasons, and people have made careers on why it happened the way it did. So we're going to have to limit ourselves, right? So one thing, when I think about what do I mean by this? Well, I do want them to be able to tell me what happened with the whole Cortez Aztec situation. Who was involved? What were the major events? What advantages did the Spanish have? What advantages did the Aztecs have? And where did this happen? I also want them to be able to recount how Pizarro took over the Incan Empire. Same kind of things, a whole bunch of recall. And then I want them to be able to describe unit terms, and that should also be at the recall level for now. Or we're going to make it at comprehension, actually. I want them to understand what those words mean, not just recite a definition. If I want to think about it more deeply, I really need to identify who does matter here. I mentioned a bunch of people. Do I really need to include them all? Maybe, maybe not. Which events are important to me? What advantages do I want to talk about? In other words, what is the level of detail? Now, this is all a bunch of facts. And note that all of these, right, in this outline format are at a lower level of cognition. Oh, I didn't change this one. It should also be recall. I want all these things to come together to create some kind of comprehension. They're going to be linking these ideas across with one another and to other things that they already know. What this would look like in an expanded form. And this is really the level of detail that you need to go to, not when you're submitting your learning targets or your objectives to me, but when you're thinking through, what am I actually going to be teaching? This is how detailed things should be getting. You need to know, well, what do I mean by comprehending how and why? What does that amount to? And you need to give an actual explanation of what you mean by that. If you don't know what you're trying to get them to understand, you probably won't get them to understand that, right? They'll understand some things, but maybe not what you want them to. When I talk about who the major players were in each section, these are the three that I'm going to talk about. These are my three major events. These are my advantages that the Spanish had. These are the Aztec advantages, and this is the location. I do the same thing for my other goals, right? Again, these are all facts. They just have to know this stuff. And one of the things that you're going to read about it is how facts and basic knowledge is really the foundation for everything else. And in Bloom's taxonomy, all the higher levels of comprehension, application, analysis, evaluation, and creation or synthesis are all resting on a foundation of recall. If you can't remember things, you can't really comprehend them, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So I have to go into and think through exactly what I mean by all of this stuff. A second example, using some science materials, has to do with this material online. It's called Interactions in Nature, or in-class science material. It's more grade 4 stuff about life science, and it's all about different ecosystems and what's going on in there. I have a bunch of terms: populations, communities, competitions, adaptations, symbiosis, and there are 3 kinds they talk about, and then predator-prey. So I have 7 different terms. Really, I have 3 more, 10 total terms in here. And it goes through all basically in an ecosystem, what are the types of relationships that are happening, okay? And so I might develop a set of goals that look something like this. My overall goal is that I want my students to be able to describe the many relationships and characteristics that exist in a given ecosystem. When I put this at the application level, what I mean by this is that if I give them an ecosystem and all the necessary information, they can pull out and see all the different relationships that exist. They can tell what populations are in there, what communities are in there, what adaptations people have to compete, who's competing with who are the predators, who are the prey, what are the adaptations of different kinds that help them survive, and then what types of symbiotic relationships are existing. And so, right, what I say, the many relationships and characteristics, all my sub-goals tell me what I mean by that. They can tell my students, my parents, myself, exactly what I mean. And the main benefit of this exercise, and it takes a long time if you're teaching something for the first time, and you probably won't do a great job the first year through until you see the bigger picture of having gone through a whole curriculum at least once. My goals still change every single year because I try to make them a little bit better to work with other lessons and other units and so on. But the main benefit of this is really thinking through in detail, how do all these ideas connect? How do I use them to make the lesson more effective, to make it last longer, to make it more meaningful, to go deeper? A final example I'll use is with math, and this is based off of this little division with remainders lesson. It starts with students using counters, and you'll note that they're just basically using counters because everything is ones. In other words, they're not doing any division of the tens columns. And if I look at all these different problems, I see different formats that I probably would want to use. I have some word problems in there. But when I look at this, all of them will have single digit answers, and the numbers that they're being divided on are single digit. the reason why is that I'm building to lesson 2, which is where I start using base 10 blocks to visually model what it's like to divide with remainders using the tens column, right? So here in this lesson, I need to restrict myself to just those answers with single digit answers or quotients. My goals might look something like this, a lot simpler, a lot less detail. Students will be able to solve division problems with single digit quotients and remainders. Okay, great. Fairly stated, and it's straightforward. I will say that usually math is the easiest out of all the different content areas. So math majors, you got it easy here. It's going to get more difficult later. When I think about what does this mean, then well, students will be able to determine the remainder in a division problem. Okay, I will also want them to be able to use counters because I'm going to decide that visually representing it is an important skill, that it's not just about memorizing number sentences or number facts, that I also want a different kind of relationship with numbers. And I want them to solve numeric division problems with remainders without using counters. Hey, this got messed up on me. There we go. And I want them to do that with number sentences and with word problems. Again, all these are with single digit quotients and remainders. Now, the trick with mathematics then becomes that how do I split up my assessments to have a good sample of the different quotients, of the different divisors, and of the different remainders, right? I want to balance that across. Also, my word problems, I have to consider some potential issues of reading ability that my students have, the terminology I use, sentence structure, how many do they need to do, and basically, how many times does somebody need to demonstrate or successfully solve a problem before I feel confident that I have a good read on whether or not they can do it, right? If I just do one, well, that's some information, but if they get it wrong, does that mean they'd get everything wrong? Probably not. And so I have to figure out how many times do they need to do it for me to feel good. We'll talk more about that going forward because it applies to science. It applies to every other content area where you're having them demonstrate a skill. How many times do they need to do it for you to be convinced that they can do it? And that's about it. So again, just to refresh the memory, wanted an outline format. I want the goal of the lesson at a comprehension level or higher. And then all the sub goals tell me and you exactly what that big lesson goal amounts to. How do you break it down into sub skills? Okay, and if you have any questions about this, I will be posting a discussion board that you can put your questions on, and I will answer those on the next round of assignments and descriptions. All right, have a great night.